Hello, my friend. Come in, sit down, close every other tab you have open, and just be here with me for the next little while. I want to start today with a question, and I want you to answer it honestly, just to yourself, right now, in your own head. How many grammar rules do you know? Really think about it. Present simple, present continuous, present perfect continuous, past simple, past continuous, past perfect, first conditional, second conditional, third conditional, mixed conditionals, relative clauses, passive voice, reported speech, phrasal verbs, modal verbs of deduction. If you have been studying English for more than a year or two, I am willing to bet that you know most of these terms. Some of you reading this, or rather listening to this, could probably teach a grammar class yourselves. You have notebooks full of rules, you have apps on your phone with grammar exercises, you have watched hundreds of videos explaining the difference between since and for. Now here is my second question, and this one is going to sting a little bit, but I promise you it comes from love, not from judgment. When a native English speaker starts talking to you at a normal, natural speed, in a real conversation, not a textbook dialogue, not a slow, clear classroom recording, but real, fast, connected, messy English the way people actually speak it on the street, in a coffee shop, in a business meeting, in a movie without subtitles. Do you understand them? Be honest. For most of you, the answer is no. Or maybe it is sometimes, which really means no, but I catch a few words and I guess the rest. And here is the part that I really want you to sit with for a moment. You know more grammar than most native speakers. I mean that literally. Ask an average native English speaker what a third conditional is, and most of them will look at you with a blank face. They use it perfectly every single day without ever having studied the rule. Meanwhile, you, the learner, know the rule inside and out. You can write it on a whiteboard, you can explain it to someone else, and yet, when real English comes at you in real time, you freeze. Why? Why does this happen to millions of learners around the world? Why do people spend 5 years, 10 years, even 15 years studying English grammar, collecting rules like stamps in an album, and still feel like a deer caught in headlights the moment a native speaker starts chatting with them naturally? I am going to tell you why, and it is not because you are not smart enough. It is not because you do not work hard enough. It is not because English is uniquely difficult, or because you started too late, or because you do not have the gift for languages. None of that is true. The real reason is much simpler and honestly much more hopeful, because it means the fix is available to every single one of you, starting today. The reason is this: you have been building a house by memorizing the blueprint without ever picking up a hammer. Grammar is the blueprint. It is useful, it is not useless, and I am not here today to tell you to burn your grammar books, so do not worry, we are not going in that direction. But a blueprint alone does not make a house. You can memorize every measurement, every angle, every material listed on that piece of paper, and if you never actually pick up wood and nails and start building, you will never ever have a house to live in. Fluency is the house. And the tool that builds it, the hammer, the nails, the years of construction work, that tool is listening, not passive, background noise listening, not put on a show while I fold laundry and don't understand a word listening. I mean deep, intentional, repeated, immersive listening, the kind that rewires your brain the same way it rewired your brain when you were a small child learning your very first language. My name is Professor William Parker, and welcome back to the Speaking Mindset. If you are new here, welcome. I am so glad you found this channel, because what I am about to walk you through today has changed the trajectory of thousands of students I have worked with over the years. Students who are stuck exactly where you might be stuck right now, full of knowledge, empty of confidence. Today, we are not doing a grammar lesson. Today, I want to teach you how to listen to English in a way that actually builds fluency, the natural way, the way your brain was designed to acquire language in the first place. Grab a coffee, grab a tea, get comfortable, because this is going to be one of the most important lessons you ever sit through on your English journey. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Grammar Trap. I want to tell you about a student of mine. I will call him Deniz, because that was not his real name, but his story is so common that I have met a version of Deniz in almost every country I have taught in. Deniz came to me after studying English for 9 years. 9 years. He had passed advanced grammar exams. He could diagram a sentence better than most English teachers. He knew the difference between used to and would for past habits. He knew when to use the and when to leave it out, which, if you know English, you know is one of the hardest things in the entire language. And yet, when Deniz opened his mouth to speak, he would freeze. He told me it felt like his brain turned into a filing cabinet, and every time he wanted to say a sentence, he had to run to the cabinet, search through hundreds of drawers labeled present perfect, third conditional, phrasal verbs, find the right rule, check it twice, and only then, slowly, painfully, produce a sentence. By the time he found the right rule, the conversation had already moved on. People were staring at him, waiting, and he felt embarrassed, so he just said yes, or okay, or nothing at all. Does this sound familiar to you? If it does, I want you to know something very important right now. This is not your fault. This is not a sign that you are bad at languages. This is the completely predictable result of the method you were taught with. You were taught English the way you might be taught how to fix a car engine from a textbook, without ever opening the hood. You learnt the names of every part, the function of every part, the theory behind every part. But you never actually touched the engine with your own hands enough times to develop the instinct, the feel, the automatic reflex that a real mechanic has. Here is the deep truth about how the human brain processes language, and I want you to really absorb this because it changes everything. Speaking and understanding language in real time is not a conscious, rule-based activity. It cannot be. Think about the speed of natural conversation. Native speakers speak somewhere between 2 and 3 words per second in casual conversation. That means you have a fraction of a second to understand each word, connect it to the words around it, understand the meaning of the whole sentence, and prepare your own response. There is no time, none at all, to consciously search through grammar rules. If you had to think, okay, this is a question, so I need to invert the subject and the auxiliary verb, and then I need to remember if this is present simple or present continuous, the conversation would be over before you finish the sentence. This is why grammar study on its own cannot produce fluent speech. It is not that grammar knowledge is useless, it absolutely has its place, and we will talk about that place later in this video. But grammar knowledge lives in a different part of your brain than fluent automatic language use. Grammar knowledge is what scientists and linguists call explicit knowledge. It is conscious, it is rule-based. It is the kind of knowledge you can write down, explain, and test with a multiple-choice exam. Fluent language use, on the other hand, comes from what is called implicit knowledge, or sometimes procedural knowledge. This is knowledge that lives below the level of conscious thought. It is automatic, it is instinctive. It is the same kind of knowledge that lets you ride a bicycle without thinking about the physics of balance, or lets you catch a ball without calculating its trajectory in your head. Here is the critical insight that changed everything for Deniz, and I hope it changes everything for you too. Explicit knowledge and implicit knowledge are built by completely different processes. You build explicit knowledge, grammar rules, vocabulary lists, by studying, memorizing, and analyzing. But you build implicit knowledge, the instinct for language, the ability to speak without translating, the ability to understand without consciously decoding, only through massive amounts of exposure. Through hearing the language again and again and again, in context, until your brain starts to recognize patterns automatically, the same way it recognized the patterns of your native language when you were a small child. Think about your native language for a moment. However you learned it, you did not learn it by first memorizing grammar rules. Nobody sat a 2-year-old down and explained the present perfect tense. You acquired your native language by hearing it, thousands and thousands of hours of it, from the people around you, long before you understood a single grammatical term. By the time you went to school, and a teacher finally explained what a noun or a verb was, you had already been speaking fluently, correctly, instinctively for years. The grammar lesson at school did not teach you your native language. It simply gave names to patterns your brain had already absorbed through years of listening. This is not some strange coincidence. This is how the human brain is built to acquire language. And here is the beautiful, hopeful part of this lesson. This system, this natural language acquisition device, as some linguists call it, does not disappear when you become an adult. It slows down a little, yes, it becomes slightly less automatic, yes, but it never turns off. Adults can still acquire language the natural way, through exposure and listening, And when they do, something remarkable happens. The frozen, panicked feeling that Denise described, the filing cabinet feeling, starts to melt away. Instead of searching for rules, the right words simply start to appear. Instead of translating in your head, you start understanding directly in English without your native language getting in the way at all. This is what we are going to build together over the course of this lesson, and honestly, over the course of your ongoing journey with this channel. Not another grammar rule to memorize, not another vocabulary list to cram before bed. A completely different relationship with the English language, one built on listening, on exposure, on letting your brain do what it was designed to do all along. Before we move forward, I want you to release something. I want you to release the guilt. So many of my students carry this heavy guilt, this feeling that they are lazy or undisciplined if they are not sitting with a grammar book every single day, drilling exercises. I am here to tell you, as someone who has taught languages for many years, that this guilt is misplaced. The discipline you need going forward is not the discipline of memorization, it is the discipline of consistent, intentional listening. And once you understand how to do that properly, which is exactly what the rest of this video is about, you will find that it is not only more effective than grammar drilling, it is also, frankly, a lot more enjoyable. Chapter 2. How your brain actually learned your first language. Let's take a journey together, back in time, back to when you were an infant. I know none of us remember this period of our lives consciously, but I want you to imagine it, because understanding this process is the key that unlocks everything else in this video. When you were born, you understood 0 words of any language, not one. And yet, within about 12 months, most babies begin producing their first recognizable words. Within 2 to 3 years, most children are forming full sentences, asking questions, telling simple stories, making jokes even, all without ever opening a textbook, without ever taking a single grammar lesson, without ever translating anything into another language, because they had no other language to translate from. How did this happen? It happened through a process linguists call language acquisition, and it is fundamentally different from the process most of us experienced in school, which is called language learning. I want you to understand the difference clearly, because this distinction is at the very heart of everything I teach on this channel. Language learning, the school method, is conscious. It involves studying rules, memorizing vocabulary lists, doing grammar exercises, and consciously applying rules when you speak or write. This is how most of you were taught English in school, and it is how many people are taught foreign languages around the world. It produces knowledge about the language. Language acquisition, the baby method, is subconscious. It happens through exposure to comprehensible language in meaningful contexts, without any conscious study of rules at all. This is how you learned your native language, and it produces the ability to use the language automatically and instinctively. Here is a fact that surprises many of my students. Babies are exposed to an enormous, almost unimaginable amount of language input before they ever produce meaningful speech. Researchers estimate that by the time a child speaks their first real words, they have already heard many hundreds, even thousands of hours of language directed at them or around them. And even after those first words appear, children continue to listen far more than they speak for years. A 4-year-old child has already absorbed tens of thousands of hours of listening input by the time they can hold a proper conversation. This period, this long stretch of time, where a child is absorbing language through listening before they can produce much of it themselves, is sometimes called the silent period, and it is one of the most important and most overlooked concepts in language learning for adults. Think about it this way. Nature did not design language acquisition to start with speaking. Nature designed it to start with listening, with massive amounts of input, and speaking emerges naturally afterward, almost as a side effect of enough listening, rather than as the starting point. Now compare this to how most adult English learners approach the language. From day one, in many classrooms and many apps, learners are pushed to speak. Say this sentence, repeat after me, answer this question in English. There is often very little emphasis on simply listening, absorbing, letting the language wash over you before you are expected to produce it. It is, in a sense, backwards. It is like asking someone to run a marathon on their very first day of training, before their body has built up any endurance at all. This is not to say that speaking practice is unimportant, And please do not walk away from this video thinking I am telling you to never speak English. Speaking practice absolutely matters, and later in this video, I will give you a clear framework for how listening and speaking work together. But what I want you to deeply understand right now is this. The foundation, the bedrock, the raw material that speaking is built from is input. It is listening. Before your mouth can produce fluent English, your ears and your brain need to absorb a massive amount of English first. You cannot pour water out of an empty cup. There is a wonderful concept from a linguist named Stephen Krashen, who spent decades researching how humans acquire language, and I want to share it with you because it explains, in scientific terms, exactly what we are talking about today. Krashen proposed what he called the comprehensible input hypothesis. In simple terms, it states that we acquire language in only one way, by understanding messages, by understanding input that is slightly above our current level. Not input we already fully understand, because that teaches us nothing new, and not input that is far too advanced, because if we understand almost nothing, our brain cannot extract any pattern from it either. The sweet spot is input we understand maybe 80, 85, 90% of, with enough new material mixed in that our brain can start to guess, infer, and gradually absorb the remaining unknown pieces from context. This is exactly how a child acquires their native language. A parent does not speak to a 2-year-old using the same complexity of language they would use with an adult. Parents naturally simplify, they repeat, they use context, gestures, tone of voice, and the immediate physical environment to help the child understand. The child is constantly receiving input that is comprehensible enough to follow, but rich enough to stretch their growing understanding. Over time, as the child's understanding grows, the complexity of the language around them grows too. This is comprehensible input in its purest, most natural form. For adult English learners, this means something very practical and very important. If you are consuming English content that you understand almost nothing of, fast movies with no subtitles, native speed podcasts about topics you know nothing about, advanced academic lectures, you are not giving your brain comprehensible input. You are giving it noise. Your brain cannot learn from pure noise because it has nothing to hold on to, nothing to connect to what it already knows. This is why so many learners feel like listening practice doesn't work for them. They are doing it wrong, not because they lack discipline, but because nobody taught them the actual mechanism behind effective listening. On the other hand, if you only ever listen to content that is far too easy for you, content you already fully understand, your brain has nothing new to acquire either. You are simply confirming what you already know, which feels comfortable but does not push your fluency forward. This is why many learners plateau after reaching an intermediate level. They stay in their comfort zone of easy content and never push into that beautiful zone of comprehensible, slightly challenging input where real growth happens. I want you to picture this as a kind of staircase. At the bottom of the staircase is content that is too simple, content you have completely mastered already. At the top of the staircase, far, far above you, is content that is far too advanced, native speed conversation about complex topics with heavy accents and cultural references you do not understand. The goal is never to jump straight from the bottom to the top. The goal is to find the very next step, the content that is just slightly above where you currently stand. Understand it as fully as you can, and then take the next step and the next, gradually climbing day after day, week after week, month after month. This is precisely why this video exists and why this channel exists. I want to teach you, step by step, exactly how to build this staircase for yourself, how to find the right kind of listening content, how to listen to it in a way that actually builds your brain's instinct for English, and how to progress steadily until one day, without even fully realizing when it happened, you will notice that you are understanding native speakers, real conversations, real movies, real podcasts, without translating, without panicking, without freezing. That day is coming for you. I have seen it happen for thousands of learners, and it will happen for you too, if you follow the process I am about to lay out for you in the rest of this video. Chapter 3. Why translation is quietly sabotaging you. I want to talk about a habit that almost every English learner has, a habit that feels completely natural, feels helpful, feels like the obvious thing to do, and yet is one of the biggest hidden obstacles standing between you and true fluency. I am talking about translation. When you hear an English sentence, what happens in your mind? Be honest with yourself. For most learners, especially at the beginner and intermediate stages, the process looks something like this. You hear the English words, your brain quickly converts them into your native language. You understand the meaning in your native language. Then, when you want to respond, you form your thought in your native language first, and then you translate that thought back into English, word by word, or phrase by phrase, searching for the right vocabulary and the right grammar structure along the way. This process, this constant back and forth translation, feels necessary because it is the bridge you built early in your learning journey. When you knew very little English, translation was the only tool available to you, and it served an important purpose. It helped you connect new words to concepts you already understood. There is nothing wrong with using translation as a beginner tool. But here is the problem, and I want you to really understand this deeply. Translation is a bridge meant to be crossed and eventually left behind, not a permanent structure you should live on for the rest of your English journey. Why is constant translation such a serious obstacle to fluency? Let me explain in very practical terms. First, translation is slow. I mentioned earlier that natural conversation moves at 2 to 3 words per second. The translation process, hearing English, converting to your native language, understanding, forming a response in your native language, converting back to English, takes far, far longer than that. This is precisely why so many learners feel like they are always one step behind in conversations, why they need people to repeat things, why they take a long pause before responding even when they actually know the words they need. Translation creates a bottleneck that no amount of vocabulary study can fix, because the problem is not what you know. It is the extra, unnecessary step your brain is taking to process what you know. Second, translation is often inaccurate, because languages do not map onto each other in a clean, word-for-word way. Every language has idioms, expressions, and structures that simply do not exist in other languages. If you are constantly trying to translate English into your native language and back again, you will constantly run into these mismatches, moments where there is no direct word-for-word equivalent, and your brain either gets stuck or produces an awkward, unnatural sentence that a native speaker would never actually say. This is often why learners who rely heavily on translation, even very advanced learners, still sound slightly off or unnatural when they speak, even when their grammar is technically correct. Third, and this is perhaps the most important point, translation prevents you from ever building direct connections between English words and their meanings. Think about it this way. Right now, when you hear the word dog in your native language, you do not translate it into English and then picture a dog. You simply picture a dog directly. The word in your native language is directly connected to the concept in your mind, with no middle step. This direct connection is what fluency actually is. Fluent language use means that words are directly connected to meaning, feeling, and concept, without any translation step in between. As long as you keep rooting every English word through your native language first, you are preventing that direct connection from ever forming. You are keeping your English forever dependent on your native language, forever a step removed, forever slower and less automatic than it could be. Now, I know some of you are thinking, Professor Parker, this all makes sense, but how do I stop translating? It feels automatic. I don't even choose to do it, it just happens. This is such an important question, and I promise you, I am not going to leave you without an answer. You cannot simply decide, through willpower alone, to stop translating. Telling yourself stop translating while you listen to English does not work, because the translation habit is not a conscious choice you are making moment to moment. It is a deeply ingrained mental pathway built over years. The only real way to break this pattern is to starve it of the conditions it needs to survive, and to feed a new pathway instead. And this brings us right back to listening, because the specific type of listening practice I am going to teach you in the coming chapters is designed precisely to build direct English to meaning connections in your brain, bypassing translation entirely. When you listen to comprehensible content where you can understand the meaning directly from context, from tone, from repetition, from visuals if there are any, without needing to consciously translate, you are training your brain to connect English sounds directly to meaning. Over time, with enough repetition, this direct pathway becomes stronger and faster than the old translation pathway, and eventually the translation habit fades away almost entirely, not because you forced it away, but because you built something better to replace it. I want to share something that might feel a little uncomfortable at first, but I promise it is liberating once you accept it. In the beginning stages of listening-based learning, especially as an intermediate learner transitioning away from translation, you are going to encounter moments where you do not fully understand every single word. And your instinct, your old habit, is going to scream at you to pause, look up the word, translate it, write it down, fully understand it before moving forward. I want you to resist that instinct as much as you reasonably can. This is one of the hardest habits to break, but it is also one of the most transformative shifts you can make. Real comprehensible input listening is not about understanding 100% of every word. It is about understanding enough of the overall meaning to follow along, to stay engaged, and to let your brain naturally fill in the gaps from context, repetition, and exposure over time. This is exactly how children acquire vocabulary in their native language. Nobody sits down with a 2-year-old and defines every single new word they encounter. The child hears a new word multiple times in different contexts, and gradually their brain pieces together the meaning on its own, without any dictionary at all. You have this exact same ability, this exact same capacity for natural word acquisition still inside you as an adult, and listening-based learning is how you activate it. So here is my challenge to you for this chapter, and I want you to genuinely try this in your next listening session. The next time you sit down to listen to English content, whatever level is appropriate for you, and we will talk about choosing the right content very soon, I want you to make a conscious agreement with yourself. No pausing to translate every unknown word. No opening a dictionary app every 30 seconds. Instead, when you hit a word or phrase you do not understand, simply let it go. Keep listening and trust that context and repetition will teach you what you need to know over time. This single shift, releasing your grip on the need for complete, immediate, word-by-word understanding, is one of the most powerful things you can do to accelerate your journey toward true fluency. Chapter 4. The listening method that actually builds fluency. Now we arrive at the heart of this lesson, the part I know many of you have been waiting for. How, exactly, should you listen to English in order to build real, lasting fluency? Not just any listening, but the specific type of listening that trains your brain the way a child's brain is trained, the type that builds instinct instead of just information. I want to introduce you to a framework I have used with hundreds of students over the years, and I call it the 3-layer listening method. It has 3 distinct layers, and each layer serves a different purpose in building your fluency. Many learners only ever use one of these layers, usually the least effective one, and then wonder why their listening skills are not improving despite hours and hours of practice. When you understand how to combine all 3 layers, that is when the real transformation begins. The first layer is what I call foundation listening. This is listening to content that is easy for you, content you understand almost completely, somewhere around 95 to 100% comprehension. I know this might sound counterintuitive. Many learners think, if I already understand it, what is the point of listening to it? But foundation listening serves a crucial purpose. It builds fluency of processing, not fluency of knowledge. When you listen to easy content, your brain is not struggling to figure out meaning, so it is free to focus entirely on processing speed, on recognizing sounds instantly, on hearing connected speech patterns, on getting used to the rhythm and music of English without any cognitive strain. This is exactly why foundation listening should make up a significant portion of your listening practice, especially early in this new approach. Do not skip this layer, and do not feel embarrassed about using easy content. Even advanced learners benefit enormously from foundation listening, because it is where automaticity, that instant, effortless recognition of English sounds and patterns, is truly built. The second layer is what I call growth listening. This is the comprehensible input sweet spot I described earlier, content, where you understand somewhere between 70 and 90% of what is being said. This is where your vocabulary expands, where your understanding of grammar in natural use deepens, where new expressions and structures get absorbed into your instinctive knowledge. Growth listening should feel slightly challenging, but never overwhelming. If you find yourself completely lost, unable to follow the general thread of what is happening, the content is too difficult, and you should step back to something easier. If you find the content so easy that you are not learning anything new, you should step up to something more challenging. Growth listening is where the magic really happens, but it only works properly when paired with a strong foundation, which is why layer 1 matters so much. The third layer is what I call stretch listening. This is content that is genuinely challenging for you, native speed content on topics you may not be fully familiar with, where your comprehension might drop to 50 or 60%, sometimes even lower. Stretch listening should be used sparingly, and its purpose is different from the other two layers. It is not primarily about acquiring new language in the moment, because when comprehension drops too low, the comprehensible input mechanism I described earlier stops working effectively. Instead, stretch listening serves to train your ear for real-world, native-speed English, to expose you to the actual, unfiltered way English is spoken outside the classroom, and to build your tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, which is an enormously important psychological skill for any language learner. Many learners panic the moment they do not understand something completely, and that panic itself becomes an obstacle. Stretch listening, done in small, manageable doses, helps you build comfort with not understanding everything, which paradoxically helps you understand more over time, because panic and anxiety actively interfere with your brain's ability to process language. Now, how do these three layers work together in a real, practical listening routine? I recommend that the majority of your listening time, somewhere around 50 to 60%, be spent in growth listening, your comprehensible input sweet spot. Around 30% of your time should be spent in foundation listening, building that effortless, automatic processing speed, and the remaining 10 to 20% can be spent in stretch listening, pushing your boundaries and training your tolerance for challenging, real-world English. I also want to teach you about a specific listening technique within these layers that dramatically accelerates the acquisition process. I call it layered repetition, and here is how it works. Instead of listening to a piece of content one single time and moving on to something new, which is what most learners instinctively do, I want you to listen to the same piece of content multiple times, but with a different focus each time. On your first listening, simply listen for general understanding. Do not worry about specific words or details, just try to grasp the overall topic, the general flow, the main idea. Let your brain relax into the sounds without pressure. On your second listening, listen a little more actively. Try to catch more specific details, more individual words and phrases. Notice patterns you might have missed the first time. If you have access to a transcript, and I highly recommend using content that comes with transcripts or subtitles when you are practicing this technique, this is a wonderful time to read along while you listen, connecting the written words directly to the sounds you are hearing. On your third listening, and this step is optional but incredibly powerful for advanced progress, try listening without any text at all, purely by ear, and notice how much more you understand compared to your very first listening. This progression, this repeated exposure to the same content with different levels of focus, mimics almost exactly how a child hears the same words, phrases, and stories repeated over and over in their early years, until those patterns become deeply, permanently ingrained. I know that some of you might worry that repeating the same content multiple times is boring, or that it wastes time you could spend on new material. I want to gently push back on that instinct. Repetition is not the enemy of learning. It is one of the most powerful tools of learning, and modern language classrooms, with their obsession with constantly moving on to new material, new units, new chapters, have often undervalued the power of deep, repeated exposure to the same content. Choose content you genuinely enjoy, content with a story or topic that interests you, and repetition will not feel like a chore. It will feel like watching your favorite movie again, noticing new details each time. Chapter 5. Choosing the right content for your level. One of the most common mistakes I see English learners make, even learners who fully understand and believe in the listening-based approach we have been discussing, is choosing content that is completely wrong for their current level. This single mistake can undermine even the best intentions, because as we discussed, Comprehensible input only works its magic when the content sits in that sweet spot of understanding. Not too easy, not too hard. Let's talk about how to actually find content at the right level for you, because I know this can feel confusing, especially with the overwhelming amount of English content available online today. First, I want you to honestly assess your current level, not the level you wish you were at, not the level your diploma says you are at, but your real, current, practical listening comprehension level. A simple way to test this is to try listening to a few minutes of different types of content and notice how much you understand without any subtitles or transcripts. If you understand nearly everything effortlessly, that content is foundation level for you. If you understand most of it but need to concentrate and you occasionally miss some details, that is likely growth level content for you. If you feel lost, catching only isolated words here and there, unable to follow the general thread, that is stretch level content for you right now, and that is completely fine. It simply tells you where to place that content in your listening rotation. For learners who are in the earlier stages of this journey, I strongly recommend starting with content specifically designed for language learners. This might include graded readers with audio, podcasts specifically created for English learners that use simplified vocabulary and slower speech, or videos designed for learners with clear pronunciation and repeated key vocabulary. There is absolutely no shame in this. In fact, I consider this an essential stepping stone, not a lesser form of learning. Some learners feel embarrassed using beginner or learner content, feeling that it is somehow not real English, but I promise you, this content plays a crucial role in building your foundation, and skipping straight to native speed content before you are ready almost always backfires, leading to frustration, discouragement, and often learners giving up on listening practice altogether. As your comprehension improves, and you will notice this happening gradually, sometimes so gradually you barely notice it happening at all, until one day you realize a video that used to feel impossible now feels manageable. You can begin transitioning toward more natural, native speed content. This might include podcasts on topics you are personally interested in, YouTube videos from native-speaking creators, television shows and movies, though I recommend starting with genres that use everyday, conversational language rather than heavy technical jargon or historical dramas with archaic language patterns. I want to give you a particularly important piece of advice here. Choose content based on genuine personal interest, not based on what you think you should be listening to. If you love cooking, listen to cooking shows and cooking channels in English. If you love true crime stories, listen to true crime podcasts. If you are fascinated by history, listen to history podcasts. If you love video games, watch English language gaming content. The specific topic matters far less than your genuine emotional engagement with the content, because engagement dramatically affects how deeply your brain processes and retains what it hears. Boredom is one of the biggest silent killers of language learning progress. If you are bored, your attention wanders, and if your attention wanders, comprehensible input, no matter how perfectly leveled, cannot do its work, because your brain simply is not fully present and engaged with the material. I also want to address something that comes up frequently with my students: the use of subtitles. Should you use English subtitles? Should you use subtitles in your native language? Should you use no subtitles at all? My honest answer is that it depends on your current stage and your specific goals for that particular listening session, and there is real value in using different approaches at different times. Native language subtitles, meaning subtitles in your own language while listening to English audio, can be useful very early in your journey, or when watching content purely for enjoyment and general comprehension of plot and story. However, I want to caution you against relying on native language subtitles too heavily or for too long, because this approach actively encourages the translation habit we discussed earlier. Your eyes read your native language, your brain processes meaning in your native language, and the English audio becomes almost background noise that your brain does not need to fully engage with, since you are already getting the meaning through reading. English subtitles, meaning subtitles in English while listening to English audio, are, in my professional opinion, one of the most powerful tools available to intermediate and advanced learners. This approach allows you to connect the written form of English words directly to their spoken sound, reinforcing both your listening and reading skills simultaneously, without introducing your native language into the process at all. I recommend English subtitles as your primary tool for growth listening content, especially in the early repetitions of the layered repetition technique I described earlier. No subtitles at all is the ultimate goal and represents the closest approximation to real-world listening conditions, since in real conversations there are no subtitles appearing beneath people's faces as they speak to you. I recommend using no subtitle listening, particularly for foundation listening content that is already easy for you, and gradually incorporating more no subtitle listening into your growth listening as your comprehension improves over time. A practical suggestion I give to many of my students is this: when working with a new piece of growth listening content, watch or listen once with English subtitles to build initial comprehension, then watch or listen again without subtitles, testing yourself, noticing how much you can now follow purely by ear thanks to that first pass. This combination gives you the best of both approaches, building comprehension while also training pure listening skill. Chapter 6: Building your daily listening habit. Understanding the theory behind comprehensible input, the 3 layers of listening, and how to choose appropriate content is enormously valuable, but none of it matters if it does not translate into a consistent, sustainable daily habit. I have seen brilliant, motivated learners who understood every concept we have discussed today perfectly and yet made very little progress simply because they never built listening into a real, ongoing part of their daily life. And I have seen learners with far less theoretical understanding make extraordinary progress simply because they showed up day after day and listened. Consistency beats intensity every single time in language acquisition. I would rather you listen to 20 minutes of properly leveled English content every single day for 6 months than listen to 5 hours of content in one single weekend and then do nothing for the following month. This is not simply a nice motivational saying. It reflects something real about how memory and neural pathways actually work in the human brain. Language acquisition depends heavily on what researchers call spaced repetition, encountering the same patterns, sounds, and structures repeatedly over time, with gaps in between. These gaps are not wasted time, they are actually part of the learning process, because your brain continues to consolidate and process what it heard even while you sleep, even while you are doing completely unrelated activities. A daily habit, even a modest one, takes full advantage of this natural consolidation process in a way that occasional, intense study sessions simply cannot replicate. So let's talk about practically building this habit into your real life, because I know many of you are busy people with jobs, families, and countless other responsibilities competing for your time and attention. The first principle I want you to embrace is this: attach your listening habit to something you already do every single day. This is sometimes called habit stacking, and it is one of the most reliable ways to build any new habit, not just language learning habits. Do you commute to work or school? That is a perfect opportunity for foundation or growth listening through headphones. Do you cook meals? Listen while you chop vegetables and stir pots. Do you exercise, walk, or go for a run? Listening pairs beautifully with physical movement. Do you have a period of downtime before bed, or first thing in the morning while getting ready? These are all natural, already existing windows in your day where listening practice can slide in almost effortlessly, without requiring you to carve out entirely new blocks of time in an already busy schedule. The second principle is this: start smaller than you think you need to. I know the temptation, when you feel excited and motivated after learning about a new method, is to commit to something ambitious, an hour a day, 2 hours a day, and for the first week or two, that enthusiasm might carry you through. But motivation is not a reliable long-term fuel source, and I have watched countless learners burn out from overly ambitious commitments, feel guilty when they inevitably miss a day or two, and eventually abandon the habit altogether. I recommend starting with a genuinely small, almost embarrassingly small commitment, perhaps just 10 or 15 minutes a day, something so small that missing it feels almost impossible, something you could realistically do even on your busiest, most exhausted day. Once this small habit feels automatic, feels like simply a normal part of your day, the way brushing your teeth does, you can gradually expand it, adding more minutes, more sessions, more variety, without risking the collapse of the entire habit. The third principle is this: track your consistency, not your comprehension. Many learners obsess over measuring how much they understood in a given session, feeling discouraged on days when comprehension felt low, feeling triumphant on days when it felt high. I want you to shift your focus entirely away from this metric, at least for the purpose of building your daily habit. The only thing that matters for habit building is, did you show up today? Did you put in your listening time, regardless of how it felt, regardless of how much you think you understood? Some of my most successful students kept a simple habit tracker, just a calendar where they marked an X on every day they completed their listening practice. And watching that chain of X's grow became its own powerful source of motivation, completely separate from day-to-day fluctuations in how difficult or easy the material felt. The fourth principle, and this one is deeply important, is this: give yourself full permission to enjoy this process. I have met so many learners who treat listening practice as a grim, joyless obligation, something to endure rather than something to look forward to. This mindset, more than almost anything else, is what causes people to quit. I want you to actively seek out content you find genuinely entertaining, funny, moving, interesting, or exciting. Remember what we discussed earlier about engagement and emotional connection dramatically affecting how well your brain absorbs language. If you find yourself dreading your listening practice, that is a clear signal that you need to change your content, not push through with willpower alone. There is an almost unlimited amount of English content available today, across every possible interest and taste, and part of your job as a learner is to become a bit of a curator for yourself, actively searching out material that makes this journey feel less like a chore and more like something you genuinely look forward to each day. Chapter 7: The Emotional Journey of Learning to Listen. I want to take a moment in this lesson to talk about something that is rarely discussed in language courses, but that I consider absolutely essential to your success: the emotional and psychological side of this journey. Learning a language, especially unlearning old habits and building new ones, is not simply an intellectual or academic process. It is deeply emotional, and if we ignore the emotional dimension of this journey, even the best techniques in the world can fail to produce results. Let me describe something that almost every serious language learner experiences at some point, something researchers sometimes call the silence period frustration, though I like to call it the fog. This is a stage, usually occurring somewhere in the early to middle part of a serious listening-based practice, where you feel like you are putting in real effort, real consistent time, and yet you cannot clearly see or feel any improvement. Everything still sounds fast. Everything still sounds like a blur of sound rather than clear, distinct words and meaning. This stage can be incredibly discouraging, and it is precisely at this stage that many learners give up, right before they were about to experience a breakthrough. I want you to understand something important about how skill acquisition actually works in the human brain, something that applies not just to language but to almost any complex skill, from playing a musical instrument to learning a sport. Progress is rarely linear. It does not move forward in a smooth, steady, visible line where you can see yourself getting a little bit better every single day. Instead, progress in complex skills tends to happen in what researchers sometimes describe as a stair-step or plateau pattern. You put in consistent effort, and for a period of time, sometimes weeks, sometimes even a couple of months, it feels like nothing is changing at all. Your brain is working hard behind the scenes, quietly building neural connections, quietly strengthening pathways, but this internal work is not yet visible in your conscious, moment-to-moment experience of listening. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, often triggered by nothing specific that you can identify, there is a jump. Suddenly, a podcast that felt impossible last month feels manageable. Suddenly, you catch yourself understanding an entire sentence without any conscious translation at all, and you almost do not notice it happened until after the fact, when you stop and think, wait, I just understood that completely naturally. I share this with you not simply to comfort you, though I do hope it brings you some comfort, but because understanding this pattern can fundamentally change how you interpret difficult, seemingly stagnant periods in your learning journey. When you hit the fog, when progress feels invisible, I want you to remember this lesson and remind yourself that invisible progress is still progress. The plateau is not evidence that the method is not working. In many cases, The plateau is precisely where the deepest, most important restructuring of your brain's language processing systems is quietly taking place, just beneath the surface of your conscious awareness. I also want to address the anxiety that often accompanies listening practice, particularly for learners who have spent years being corrected, graded, and judged on their language abilities in academic settings. Many adult learners carry a kind of low-level anxiety into every English interaction, a fear of not understanding, a fear of appearing unintelligent, a fear of embarrassing themselves. This anxiety is not simply an unpleasant emotional side effect, it actually has a measurable negative impact on language processing itself. There is a concept in language acquisition research called the affective filter, which describes how negative emotions like anxiety, stress, and fear can create a kind of mental barrier that actively blocks language input from being processed and absorbed effectively, even when that input is perfectly appropriate for your level. This means that your emotional state while listening is not a minor, irrelevant detail, it is a core part of whether your listening practice is actually effective. If you sit down to practice listening while feeling anxious, frustrated, or pressured, treating every unfamiliar word as a personal failure, you are actively working against your own progress, regardless of how well chosen your content is. I want you to approach your listening practice as much as you possibly can from a place of curiosity and calm, rather than pressure and judgment. When you encounter something you do not understand, rather than treating it as evidence of failure, I want you to try reframing it as simply useful information that tells your brain, here is something to pay a little extra attention to next time it appears. Nothing more dramatic than that. I often tell my students to imagine themselves as a curious explorer in a new landscape, rather than a student being tested and graded. An explorer does not feel ashamed when they encounter unfamiliar terrain, unfamiliar plants, unfamiliar paths. They feel curious, they investigate. They gather information gradually, over repeated visits to the same territory, without any pressure to understand everything on the very first pass. I want this to become your relationship with English listening practice. Not a test you are constantly failing, but a landscape you are gradually, patiently, curiously coming to know. Chapter 8. Combining listening with speaking. Throughout this lesson, I have placed enormous emphasis on listening, and for very good reason, because listening truly is the foundation, the essential building block that speaking is constructed from. But I want to be very clear about something important. I am not telling you to only listen and never speak. That would be an incomplete, imbalanced approach. What I am telling you is that listening should come first, should be the majority of your early practice, and should continue as an ongoing, substantial part of your practice, even as you begin actively working on speaking. Let's talk about exactly how listening and speaking work together in a healthy, effective learning journey, because understanding this relationship will help you avoid two common mistakes: relying so heavily on listening that you never actually develop your speaking muscles, or pushing yourself into speaking practice too early and too intensely before you have built enough of a foundation to draw from. Think of listening as filling up a reservoir and speaking as drawing water from that reservoir. If the reservoir is empty or nearly empty, no matter how hard you try to draw water from it, nothing meaningful will come out, and you will feel that painful, frustrating sensation of straining to speak while having very little actual language material to work with. This is exactly the situation many traditional language learners find themselves in, pushed to speak from day one, while their reservoir of absorbed, internalized English remains shallow and underdeveloped. The straining, frustrating, effortful speech that results from this imbalance is often what learners come to associate with English speaking in general, leading to speaking anxiety that can persist for years. When you dedicate real, substantial time to listening first, building up that reservoir through foundation and growth listening, something remarkable happens when you eventually do begin actively practicing speaking. Instead of straining and searching for every single word, you find that words, phrases, and even entire sentence structures start to simply appear, almost effortlessly, because your brain has already absorbed the patterns, the rhythms, and the natural phrasing of English through all that listening practice. You are not inventing English from scratch in the moment of speaking, you are drawing from a well of language that your brain has already internalized. This is why I generally recommend that learners, especially those who have felt stuck or frustrated with previous speaking-focused approaches, spend a dedicated period, perhaps several weeks to a couple of months, depending on your starting level, focusing predominantly on listening before ramping up speaking practice significantly. This does not mean avoiding speaking entirely during this period. Even small amounts of speaking, thinking in English throughout your day, narrating your own actions silently in your head, having brief conversations if the opportunity arises, all of this remains valuable. But the primary emphasis, the majority of your dedicated practice time, should lean heavily toward listening during this foundational phase. As your listening comprehension grows, and as that internal reservoir of absorbed English deepens, I want you to gradually shift toward what I call output practice, which includes not just conversation with other people, but also techniques like shadowing, where you listen to a piece of audio and speak along with it simultaneously, matching the rhythm, intonation, and pronunciation as closely as you can. Shadowing is an extraordinarily powerful bridge technique between listening and speaking, because it forces your mouth and vocal muscles to physically produce the sounds and rhythms of English, while your brain is simultaneously processing meaning, creating a direct connection between comprehension and production that pure listening alone cannot fully achieve. I also want to mention self-talk as another powerful low-pressure bridge between listening and full conversational speaking. Throughout your day, try narrating your own thoughts and actions in English, silently or quietly out loud, whichever feels comfortable to you. I am making coffee now. I wonder what I should cook for dinner tonight. This traffic is really frustrating today. This kind of low-stakes, judgment-free speaking practice allows you to activate and strengthen your speaking muscles without the social pressure and anxiety of a real conversation with another person, and it draws directly on the reservoir of natural English patterns you have been building through your listening practice. When you do begin engaging in real conversations, whether with a language exchange partner, a tutor, or native-speaking friends, I want you to bring the same curious, non-judgmental mindset we discussed in the previous chapter. Mistakes are not failures, they are simply data points, information your brain uses to refine and adjust its internal model of English. Every single fluent speaker of every single language on this planet, including your own native language, made countless mistakes on their way to fluency. The difference between a learner who eventually becomes fluent and one who gives up is rarely talent. It is almost always persistence, consistency, and a healthy relationship with the inevitable mistakes along the way. Chapter 9. Common mistakes that slow down your progress. Before we bring this lesson to a close, I want to walk through some of the most common mistakes I see English learners make when they first begin adopting a listening-focused, comprehensible input approach to their studies. Understanding these pitfalls in advance can save you months, sometimes even years, of wasted effort and unnecessary frustration. The first common mistake is choosing content that is far too difficult, too early in the process. I understand the temptation completely. You want to challenge yourself. You want to prove that you can handle real English, native speed movies, advanced podcasts, complex news broadcasts. But as we discussed in Chapter 4, when comprehension drops too low, the comprehensible input mechanism that actually drives language acquisition stops functioning effectively. You end up with hours of listening time that produces very little actual learning, along with a heavy dose of frustration and discouragement. Be honest with yourself about your current level, and be willing to use content that might feel too easy or too simple for your ego, because that content is often exactly where the real, measurable progress happens. The second common mistake is inconsistency, treating listening practice as something you do intensely for a week or two when you feel motivated, and then abandoning for weeks or months at a time when life gets busy or motivation fades. As we discussed in Chapter 6, consistency is far more important than intensity for building the kind of deep, lasting neural changes that produce real fluency. A modest, sustainable daily habit will always outperform sporadic bursts of intense effort in the long run. The third common mistake is refusing to let go of the need for complete word-by-word understanding. Many learners, especially those with a strong academic background and years of grammar-focused study, feel deeply uncomfortable with ambiguity, with not fully understanding every single word in a sentence. This discomfort leads them to constantly pause, look up words, and break the natural flow of listening, which, as we discussed, undermines the very mechanism that makes comprehensible input effective. Learning to tolerate and even embrace partial understanding is an essential skill for any successful language learner. The fourth common mistake is neglecting variety in content and context. If you only ever listen to one type of content, one particular podcast host, one particular accent, one particular topic, you risk developing a narrow, context-dependent understanding that does not transfer well to new situations. I encourage my students to gradually diversify their listening diet over time, exposing themselves to different accents, different speaking speeds, different topics, and different formats, from conversational podcasts to structured interviews to casual vlogs to narrative storytelling. This variety builds a more robust, flexible listening skill that serves you well across the wide range of real-world English situations you will eventually encounter. The fifth common mistake, and this one connects back to our earlier discussion about translation, is continuing to rely heavily on native language subtitles or translation apps long after they are truly necessary. I understand the comfort and security this provides, but as we discussed, this habit actively works against building the direct, translation-free connections that true fluency requires. I encourage you to gradually wean yourself off native language subtitles and translation tools as your comprehension improves, replacing them first with English subtitles, and eventually no subtitles at all. The sixth common mistake is abandoning grammar study entirely, swinging too far in the opposite direction after hearing messages like the one in this very video. I want to be very clear about something important. I am not telling you that grammar study is worthless or that you should never touch a grammar book again. Grammar study still has real value, particularly for understanding patterns you have already absorbed through listening, for editing and refining your writing, and for accelerating your noticing of certain structures during listening practice. What I am telling you is that grammar study alone, without substantial listening input, cannot produce fluent, automatic speech. The two approaches work best together, with listening as the primary driver of true acquisition, and grammar study serving as a helpful, supporting tool that deepens your conscious understanding of patterns your brain is simultaneously absorbing through exposure. The seventh and final common mistake I want to address is comparing your progress to other learners or to some imagined ideal timeline for fluency. Every learner's journey looks different, shaped by their starting point, their available time, the similarity between their native language and English, their exposure to English throughout their life before beginning this particular approach, and countless other factors. Comparing your Week 3 progress to someone else's Year 3 progress, or to a polyglot influencer's carefully edited highlight reel, serves no useful purpose and only adds unnecessary emotional weight to a journey that is already challenging enough. Your only meaningful comparison point is your own past self. Are you understanding a little more today than you did last month? That is the only question that truly matters. Chapter 10. Your Path Forward Starting Today. We have covered an enormous amount of ground together in this lesson, and I want to take a moment now to bring everything together into a clear, actionable path forward, something you can genuinely begin implementing starting today, not next week, not after you finish some other course or program, but today, right after you finish listening to this video. Here is what I want you to do. First, honestly assess your current listening level using the method we discussed in Chapter 5, trying a few different types of content and noticing how much you genuinely understand without support. Do not judge yourself for wherever you currently stand. Every single fluent speaker of English, including native speakers learning to read as children, started exactly where you are starting, at a point of limited understanding that gradually expanded through consistent exposure. Second, choose your foundation listening content, something that feels easy, close to fully comprehensible, that you can return to regularly without strain. This will become your comfortable home base, the content you turn to when you want confidence building, low-pressure listening practice. Third, choose at least one piece of growth listening content, something in that beautiful sweet spot of 70 to 90% comprehension, ideally on a topic that genuinely interests you personally. This will become the primary engine of your new vocabulary and structural growth. Fourth, Decide on your daily listening window using the habit stacking principle we discussed in Chapter 6. Attach this new practice to something you already do every day, and start with a commitment so small that it feels almost too easy to skip. Fifth, apply the layered repetition technique from Chapter 4 to at least some of your growth listening content, listening to the same material multiple times with different levels of focus, allowing repetition to do its quiet, powerful work of deepening your understanding and retention. Sixth, begin incorporating small amounts of output practice, self-talk, shadowing, or brief conversations when opportunities arise, remembering that this becomes increasingly important as your listening foundation deepens, but should not be your primary focus in these very early weeks if you are just beginning this particular approach. Seventh, and perhaps most importantly, commit to showing up consistently and extend genuine compassion toward yourself throughout this process. There will be difficult days, foggy periods where progress feels invisible, moments of frustration when a piece of content feels impossibly fast or complex. This is not failure. This is simply the natural, expected texture of real language acquisition, the same texture experienced by every successful language learner who has ever walked this path before you. I want to leave you with one final thought before we close today's lesson. Somewhere, right now, there is a version of you, perhaps 6 months from now, perhaps a year from now, who is sitting comfortably in a real English conversation, understanding naturally, responding without that frantic filing cabinet feeling we talked about at the very beginning of this video. That version of you is not a different person with some special gift you lack. That version of you is simply the you who kept showing up day after day, who trusted the process of listening over the illusion of grammar book perfection, who gave their brain the input it needed to do what it was designed to do all along. The distance between who you are today and that future version of yourself is not measured in talent, and it is not measured in the number of grammar rules you can recite. It is measured quite simply in consistent hours of comprehensible listening, applied patiently over time. You have everything you need to begin that journey right now, today, with whatever level of English you currently have. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this lesson resonated with you, if you recognized yourself in Deniz's story, in the filing cabinet feeling, in the exhausting cycle of grammar study that never quite translates into real conversation, I want you to know that you are exactly where you need to be to make a real change. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because we are going to continue building on everything we discussed today in future lessons, going deeper into specific listening strategies, specific content recommendations, and specific techniques for bridging listening into confident, natural speaking. Before I let you go today, I want to add one more layer to everything we have discussed, because I think it might be the most important layer of all, and it has less to do with method and more to do with identity. There is a quiet, often unspoken belief that many struggling English learners carry around with them, sometimes for years, without ever fully naming it out loud. The belief sounds something like this: I am not a person who is good at languages. Maybe you picked up this belief in a classroom somewhere, after a teacher corrected you one too many times in front of your classmates. Maybe you picked it up after a painful, embarrassing moment trying to speak with a native speaker who looked confused or impatient. Maybe you picked it up simply from years of comparing yourself to someone else who seemed to learn English more easily than you did. Wherever it came from, I want to address it directly, because as long as this belief sits quietly in the background of your mind, it will continue to sabotage even the best listening strategy in the world. Here is the truth, and I want you to really let this land. Fluency is not a fixed trait that some people are born with and others are not. It is not like height or eye color, something determined once at birth and unchangeable afterward. Fluency is the direct, measurable result of the quantity and quality of comprehensible input a brain has absorbed, combined with consistent opportunities for meaningful output. That is it. That is the entire equation, stripped down to its essential parts. Every single fluent English speaker on this planet, whether they are a native speaker or someone who acquired English as their second, third, or even sixth language, arrived at their fluency through massive amounts of exposure and practice, not through some innate gift that you happen to lack. I have taught students who were absolutely convinced, with total sincerity, that they simply did not have the language gene, students who had internalized this belief so deeply that it shaped every decision they made about their own learning, causing them to give up too early, to avoid speaking opportunities, to sabotage their own progress before it even had a chance to begin. And I have watched, time and again, as those very same students, once they adopted a consistent, properly structured listening practice like the one we discussed today, began to prove their own limiting belief wrong, week after week, month after month, until the belief itself simply could not survive the weight of their own growing evidence to the contrary. I want you to consider the possibility, just consider it, even if you do not fully believe it yet, that your past struggles with English were never a reflection of your fundamental capacity to learn language. They were a reflection of a method that did not align with how your brain naturally acquires language. This distinction matters enormously because a flawed method can always be replaced with a better one, but a fixed, unchangeable limitation cannot. You are not broken. You were simply using the wrong tool for far too long, and today you picked up a new one. I also want to speak directly to those of you who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed right now, wondering how you will possibly restructure your entire approach to English after months or years of doing things a different way. I want to offer you some genuine reassurance. You do not need to abandon everything you have already built. Every grammar rule you have studied, every vocabulary word you have memorized, none of that knowledge disappears or becomes wasted the moment you shift toward a listening-focused approach. In fact, that existing knowledge becomes incredibly useful scaffolding, a kind of head start that many true beginners do not have. When you begin genuinely absorbing English through comprehensible listening, all of that prior study does not sit idle in a separate, disconnected part of your brain. It begins to merge gradually with the new instinctive knowledge you are building, sometimes accelerating your progress in ways that surprise even you. Think of it this way. Imagine two learners starting a serious listening practice on the exact same day. One of them is a true beginner with zero prior exposure to English. The other is someone like many of you watching this video right now, someone with years of grammar study, a large passive vocabulary, and a strong conscious understanding of English structure, but with weak listening and speaking fluency. That second learner, despite feeling frustrated and stuck, is actually carrying a significant advantage into this new phase of learning. Their brain already has countless anchor points, familiar vocabulary, recognized grammatical patterns, existing knowledge of English spelling and word formation that a true beginner does not have. As comprehensible input starts flowing in through consistent listening practice, this existing knowledge often accelerates the acquisition process considerably, because the brain is not building entirely from scratch. It is connecting new, instinctive understanding to an already substantial foundation of conscious knowledge. This is why I often see students who have struggled for years with speaking, despite strong grammar knowledge, make surprisingly fast progress once they finally commit to serious, consistent listening practice. It might feel in those early weeks like you are starting completely over, and emotionally, that is a very understandable feeling. But structurally, in terms of what your brain actually has to work with, you are far from starting over. You are simply activating and connecting knowledge that has been sitting there, somewhat dormant, waiting for the right kind of input to bring it fully to life. I want to close this lesson with a small, personal reflection because I think it captures something important about this entire journey. Over the years, I have had the privilege of watching so many students move through exactly the transformation we have discussed today. I remember one particular moment with a student, a woman who had struggled for nearly a decade with spoken English, despite an excellent academic record in grammar and writing. After several months of consistent, properly structured listening practice, following almost exactly the framework I have shared with you today, she sent me a message that I still think about often. She said that she had been watching an English interview, something she would have found completely overwhelming just months earlier, and about halfway through, she suddenly realized she had stopped noticing that she was listening to English at all. She was simply absorbed in the conversation itself, following the ideas, reacting emotionally to what was being said, the way she would with content in her own native language. She had not consciously translated a single word, she had not searched for a single grammar rule. She had simply understood, directly and effortlessly, and it was only afterward, reflecting on the experience, that she realized what a profound shift had taken place inside her. That moment, that quiet, almost invisible moment of simply understanding without effort, without translation, without strain, is what we are working toward together. It rarely announces itself with fireworks or dramatic realization in the moment it happens. Often, you only notice it in hindsight, looking back and realizing that something that used to feel impossible now feels completely natural. This is the real, lived experience of fluency developing, not a single dramatic breakthrough day, but a long, gradual, often unnoticed accumulation of understanding, built one listening session at a time, until one day you look back and realize you have arrived somewhere entirely new. I genuinely believe that moment is waiting for every single one of you watching this video, regardless of your current level, regardless of how many years you have already spent feeling stuck, regardless of how many times you may have tried and given up before. The method we discussed today works because it aligns with something deep and fundamental about how the human brain is built to acquire language, not because of any special talent, trick, or shortcut. It simply requires two things from you: consistency and patience. Everything else, the vocabulary, the grammar instinct, the natural rhythm of speech, the confidence to speak without fear, all of that follows naturally from those two foundational commitments. So here is my final invitation to you today. Do not close this video and simply feel inspired for an hour before returning to your old habits tomorrow. Take one small, concrete action right now, today, while this lesson is still fresh in your mind. Choose one piece of listening content, anything, a podcast episode, a short video, a simple audiobook chapter, and commit to listening to it today, using the mindset we discussed, releasing the need for perfect understanding, staying curious rather than anxious, letting the meaning wash over you rather than hunting for every single word. That one small action, repeated consistently over the coming days and weeks, is the true beginning of the transformation we have been discussing throughout this entire lesson. Until next time, this has been Professor William Parker, and this is The Speaking Mindset. Keep listening, keep showing up, and I will see you in the next lesson.